This study is centered around Kenya's Wildlife Conservation and Management Act of 2013. The previous act was endorsed in 1976. So in between 1976 and 2013, there had been multiple attempts to put in place a new policy that was a lot more in line with the current realities of the country. All of them failed for a variety of different reasons. So this study hopes to be able to contribute to policy making in Kenya, as it goes forward, perhaps most importantly for the wildlife sector, but also for other sectors. And sort of how can you most effectively harness public participation in a structured manner, ensuring full contributions of all of the different facets of civil society with all of its complexities, and do so in a manner that is informed and does effectively utilize evidence.
It came at an opportune time. There are certain factors that made it possible for it to propel through the process. One was we had come from elections, so the members of parliament had time to look through this piece of legislation without looking at, is it towards election? Are they, the position they take, will it be influenced?
Citizen engagement is important because we as policymakers tend to sit in capitals and discuss important natural resource issues in capitals, whereas all the activity that is happening, that is extremely important, is in the areas where the communities and where the wildlife are living.
I'm coming in between. I would say my work was facilitative and bringing the best possible information and data together in the most honest way that I could. One was direct evidence. So we had stakeholders coming for meetings, giving their views on clauses or sections. And then those who have sent written submissions, we will analyze these submissions. There are those who will send secondary material conducted by other evidence will be generated by us, research departments. We will look at comparatively what happened in other countries, how wildlife conservation and legislations related to wildlife were enacted, and what are the issues that were covered in these pieces of legislations. So ours was facilitative, putting this information and data from stakeholders together, summarizing it, putting it before the committee so that they could use it to make decisions as they discuss this particular issue. We also played facilitative role, say follow up on issues. If stakeholders or members of the public were interested to come at a certain time or wanted to share information, we provided the platform. So it was a deliberate decision by the committee to bring all these groups together so that they debate amongst themselves. And the committee was a neutral arbiter, listening to them and hearing them, but the debate was happening. And there, that actually kind of resolved certain issue, eased tensions.
So the fact that a lot of the wildlife conservation organizations have some form of organization, it really helped us. So we sort of ended up focusing on the outliers, people who have very strong views either way, because the middle stream had already had their own meetings and were coming up with agreed points of view. And if that was not possible, it would be too costly to reach all the players. We did try to promote that through what we called breakfast meetings. So we would invite players, both nationally and internationally, who would come to speak to the House. For example, we had a former minister for Costa Rica who came and spoke to the members on an aspect of conservation that's working very well in their country. We would be able to also work with other conservation organizations that kept inviting us to listen to experts in those fields. We developed tools that made life easier for us in collecting public input. So we developed some matrix that we would then tell the stakeholders that if you have an issue with this section, tell us what is the issue, what you're proposing to be the change. And so that matrix helped us a lot because you end up appreciating that many stakeholders do actually agree on what should change in a particular clause. Once you're convinced, you don't have to engage with that anymore, because it was too time-consuming for people to come to make presentations on a bill without some structure.
So by having that structured and led process by the head of the Nature Resource Committee, Amin Abdallah, was quite a significant leapfrog from other previous processes. We had the goodwill of both the governments and donors to facilitate the process in terms of resources.
This act actually has successfully changed a number of things. And this was meant to be a breakthrough in terms of how Kenya manages its wildlife generally, from the old days, which was basically a colonial model.
To recognize the role of communities in wildlife conservation and management. If you looked at this new law that came into effect January 10th, 2014, the Kenya Wildlife Service now, in terms of board membership, has 2 community representatives.
The executive had invested immense amount of time and energy in collecting scientific evidence that should have informed the legislation, but that information was not in an easily accessible depository that the committee, through its researchers or its workers, could access. And I think that's an opportunity lost, and government needs to be able to develop a way where this information that they're collecting at taxpayers' expense is accessible to the process throughout.
What didn't work well is that there are so many competing interests, just like they are today, but we didn't have a lot of time to reconcile all those interests so that we can have a balanced kind of an act.
This was one of the very first times that public participation was being carried out in a sort of a meaningful and in a structured manner, because it was a requirement of the law. Therefore, there were no guidelines in place, there were no tools in place, there were no regulations in place. And as a consequence, there was a lot of things that sort of fell through the cracks and could have been done better.
Citizen, I think, involvement and consultation is a useful thing. Question is how you do it, and how you can make sure that you get the best out of the consultation processes and doesn't become a marketplace.
Players in the sector have to appreciate that the politicians on the table decide on the legislation. When they're on the floor of the House, they have the power to change it. So it's in the interest of the stakeholders to continually engage in capacity enhancement for decision makers in the legislature, so that they do not make legislation that is contrary to the evidence out there. Sometimes the stakeholders may have given you input, and they're very divergent inputs. So when you have a middle ground position, you need to be able to have a way of engaging with them about why you reached the middle ground position. Because one of the major criticisms is that if somebody doesn't see their proposal word for word, they start saying that the public participation was not effective. Which is why I really would suggest that parliamentary committees should have continual engagement with stakeholders in the sectors that they oversight. Because it's only in that continual engagement that you can have a holistic input into not only legislation, but the budget of that sector and the policy directions that sector is going.
Well, I hope this will be an important piece of work for policymakers to see that in their process of making decisions, they make decisions on behalf of the people, that they use evidence and data generated to make decisions that are beneficial to the people they represent, to the people they implement projects on their behalf.
A lot of people who are engaging with research and to collect evidence and to document that evidence would not be effective if public participation in legislation making does not have a place. So what public participation is giving is transforming the efforts that have been made to collect evidence to have that evidence input into where it should make a difference.
But I think eventually Parliament will have to enact a law to bring some sanity into public participation so that the qualitative aspect of it then can be legislated. For me, in addition to what is coming from the court, I would suggest that the government put rules or some regulations in terms of public participation. And especially, public participation is meaningless in absence of information. We also have to realize that not every decision the public can participate, because there are some areas where the issues that we are looking at are very technical. And so we could also try and see how we can have a mixture of technical and knowledge being applied and public participation at the same time.
My personal reflections on this study with regards to the timing and the utility of this very useful information that will be gathered is we are actually 50 years behind the clock. There's a wish that we were doing this way back in 1970, because all other related biodiversity and wildlife management related assessments have shown a decline. That shouldn't have happened if we had these kind of things in place then. I'm not saying this will have been the silver bullet, but if such conversation happened 40, 50 years ago, maybe the environment will have been different.
I think the case study and the way that it has been captured is that when you include citizens, when you include the communities, when you combine that with science and technology evidence, then that paves the way for successful legislation.